Museum on the Seam is a unique museum in Israel, displaying contemporary art that deals with different aspects of the socio-political reality, between the local and the universal, between pluralism and extreme ideology. The message of the museum calls for listening and discussion, for accepting the other and those different from us, and respect for our fellow man and his liberty.
Before being a museum on the Seam, this place was known as the Turjuman Post, an army post from 1948 to 1967, overlooking the Mandelbaum Gate, the only Jerusalem border crossing between Israel and Jordan. Before 1948, this house belonged to the Baramki family. Andoni Baramki, a famous architect, built the house and experimented with a unique style incorporating Greek and Jerusalemite architectural features. The Baramkis were forced out of the house in 1948 and lived on the Jordanian side of the border, just blocks away. After 1967, Andoni Baramki approached the Israeli authorities with papers proving the ownership of his house. His son recalls,
"Imagine my father, at the time a 70-year-old person, going to the authorities and telling them, 'Here I am now, and I want my property.' And then telling him that, 'No, you are an absentee.' And he said, 'How am I absent? I'm present.' He could not understand how he was absent and present at the same time."
The Baramkis appealed in the courts but never got possession of their house again. Instead, it is a museum on the Seam, and its history is recorded in the following sign. The Turjuman house was built in 1932 by the Arab Christian architect Anton Baramki, who purchased the site from Hassan Bey Turjuman. From 1948 to 1967, the house was used as an Israeli military outpost. Further down, the sign reads, "The idea of turning a military outpost into a site of peace and tolerance led to the opening of the Museum on the Seam for dialogue, understanding, and coexistence." Dialogue and understanding? How can that be achieved if the museum does not fully disclose its own history? Not only is Andoni Baramki's name spelled wrong, but it is never mentioned that he did not simply build the house, but actually lived there with his family. It was his beloved home, which he visited daily until his death. I shall rewrite this sign. The Turjuman house was built in 1932 by the Palestinian architect Andoni Baramki. He purchased the land from Hassan Bey Turjuman and lived in the house until it became a front line in 1948. From 1948 to 1967, the house was used as an Israeli military outpost. After 1967, the family tried to reclaim the house from Israeli authorities, but to no avail. The idea of turning a military outpost into a site of peace and tolerance led to the opening of the Museum on the Seam for dialogue, understanding, and coexistence. This museum therefore commits to acknowledging its own history and trying to remedy its very local tragedy. Khalil Sakakini was an original educator, a talented writer, and a famous public intellectual. In 1937, he built this house, which became a center for the cultural and political elites of Jerusalem. Our temporary house in Jerusalem is adjacent to Sakakini's house, right behind it in this image. Sakakini, like the rest of Karamon's Palestinian residents, was forced out of his home 60 years ago on April 30th, 1948. The house is now a daycare center funded by the Canadian Hadassah Vitzah Federation.
القتال مستحر مستمر، وقد بلغ الذروة العليا ليلة الخميس في 29/4 سنة 1948. أما الأرض فقد كانت تميد تحت أقدامنا، وأما الدار فقد كادت تسقط على رؤوسنا، وأما نحن فقد ترددنا كثيراً قبل أن أجمعنا على ترك تلك الناحية إلى أجل قريب. أوعينا في حقائبنا بعض ما نحتاج إليه من الثياب، وتركنا سائر الأشياء في بيتنا إلى أن نرجع. حرصت أن آخذ دفاتري وأوراقي لعلي أحتاج إليها، ولكن نسيت الجميع. حرصت أن آخذ نرجيلتي وهي دماغي الثاني، ولكن أخذت الناربيج ونسيت النرجيل. الوداع يا كتبي، لست أدري ما حل بك بعد رحيلنا. أنهبت؟ أحرقت؟ أنقلت معززة مكرمة إلى مكتبة عامة أو خاصة؟ أصرت إلى دكاكين البقالين يلف بأوراقك البصل؟ الوداع يا كتبي، يعز علي أن أحرم منك وأنا على أهبة الرحيل من هذه الدنيا. وهل يستطيع من كان مثلي على أهبة الرحيل أن ينشئ مكتبة جديدة؟ يعز علي أن أحرم منك وقد كنت غذائي الروحي، وكنت ولا أزال شرها إلى هذا الغذاء. لقد كنت ألازمك في ليلي ونهاري، ولم يزرني أحد في الليل أو النهار إلا وجدني مكبا على كتبي.
From the top of my roof, I am filming the roof of Sakakini's house. While the house stayed more or less the same, the landscape around it has radically changed. The house across the street, last year a beautiful one-story Palestinian home, is now being converted to a wealthy condominium property. The workers, all of them Palestinians of course, did not know who Khalil Sakakini was. They allowed me to film from the site, but the foreman wryly commented, "And so what if you make this video and people see it? Will Sakakini get his house back?" I cannot give Sakakini or Baramki their houses back, and I'm careful when neighbors ask why I am filming. I'm honest, but I know that the issue of the right of return of Palestinian refugees is incredibly loaded and has barely been acknowledged in Israel. It is therefore not a coincidence I use English here and not my native Hebrew. While I believe I should talk to Israelis in Hebrew, should include my views as part of the Israeli plethora of views, I don't feel ready, and I doubt my potential audience is. But I can imagine the sign on the house reading, Canadian Hadassah Vitzo, owned by Khalil Sakakini, who was forced to flee during the 1948 war. We have to remember, this is our history too, and until we acknowledge it to ourselves and solve it with the Palestinians, there will be no coexistence.